The divorce papers trembled in Rebecca Matthews' hands as her husband of 8 years, Daniel Matthews, stood across from her in their penthouse office, the same office where she'd built a real estate empire worth $847 million, though he'd never bothered to ask whose name graced the LLC documents stacked in her private vault. He'd called her Barren for 3 years, but the ultrasound images hidden in her designer purse showed 3 heartbeats, 3 tiny forms she'd discovered only yesterday, 3 miracles he'd never know existed, because today he was leaving her for his pregnant mistress, the woman who now stood beside him with a swollen belly and a triumphant sneer. Rebecca's hand instinctively moved to her own flat stomach, where triplets grew in secret, but she said nothing as Daniel explained how his mistress had given him what Rebecca never could, a child, an heir, a future he'd dreamed of, unaware that the very buildings surrounding them, the towers casting shadows across the city skyline, belonged to the woman he was discarding like yesterday's newspaper. The mistress, Vanessa Cole, stepped forward and spat directly onto Rebecca's face, the saliva sliding down her cheek as she whispered that barren women deserved to be replaced, but Rebecca simply wiped it away with the silk handkerchief monogrammed with her company's initials, Matthews Real Estate Holdings, the same company where Daniel worked as a senior acquisitions manager, reporting unknowingly to the wife he'd convinced himself was nothing more than a socialite living off his salary. 6 months later, when Rebecca walked into the boardroom with 3 infants strapped to her chest and a DNA test clutched in her hand, Daniel's face would turn the color of ash. But what came after that test would be far worse than any tears he'd shed. What would a man feel when he discovered the barren wife he'd abandoned owned every building he'd ever sold, every commission he'd ever earned, every success he'd attributed to his own brilliance? What would he do when he realized the triplets he'd never known about carried his DNA, the same DNA that proved his mistress's child belonged to someone else entirely? And what revenge would a woman architect who'd built an empire from nothing exact on the man who'd thrown her away for a lie? The marble floors of Matthews Real Estate Holdings headquarters gleamed under the late afternoon sun, but Rebecca Matthews barely noticed their shine as she stood in her corner office on the 47th floor, staring at the ultrasound images that had shattered her world just 24 hours earlier. 3 babies, the technician had said, with genuine excitement, 3 healthy heartbeats. But Rebecca had felt no joy, only the crushing weight of timing so cruel it seemed orchestrated by a malicious universe. For 3 years, Daniel had called her broken, his words growing sharper with each negative pregnancy test, his patience eroding like sand under relentless waves. But now, when conception had finally occurred, through a miracle she couldn't explain, he'd already made his choice to leave her for a woman who'd supposedly given him what Rebecca never could. She remembered their wedding day 8 years ago, back when Daniel had been a struggling real estate agent with more dreams than commissions, back when she'd been freshly graduated from Stanford's business school, with a trust fund from her late grandfather and a vision that terrified most investors but thrilled her. He'd loved her ambition then, had held her hand as she'd signed the papers for her first property, a dilapidated apartment complex in a neighborhood everyone else had written off, and had celebrated with cheap champagne when she'd transformed it into luxury condos that sold out within 3 months. But somewhere between her 10th building and her 50th, between her first million and her 100th, his admiration had curdled into resentment masked as concern. Daniel had suggested she didn't need to work so hard, that perhaps her stress was the reason they couldn't conceive, that maybe if she just relaxed and focused on becoming a mother instead of an empire builder, their family would finally materialize. But Rebecca had refused to believe her womb and her ambition were mutually exclusive, until the years of negative tests had made her wonder if he was right. She'd kept her business ownership private from the beginning, not out of secrecy but out of caution instilled by her grandfather, who'd warned her that money changed people and that the man who loved her should love her for herself, not her portfolio. Daniel knew she came from wealth, knew she'd inherited money, but he'd never asked for details, and she'd never volunteered them, letting him assume her grandfather had left her enough for a comfortable life, but nothing extraordinary. She'd created Matthews' real estate holdings under her maiden name's initials and a complex LLC structure that kept her face out of the press, operating through lawyers and property managers who reported to her but never mentioned her in public documents, allowing her to attend charity galas as Daniel Matthews' wife while secretly owning the venues where those galas took place. He'd been so proud when she'd gotten him an interview at a real estate company with connections, so grateful when he'd been hired as a junior agent 7 years ago, so ambitious as he'd climbed to senior acquisitions manager, never realizing every promotion had been her decision, every major deal had been her approval, every commission check had ultimately come from her accounts. The irony of her situation would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. She'd spent 8 years secretly running the company where her husband worked, watching him become successful through her behind-the-scenes maneuvering, all while he'd grown to resent her supposed lack of contribution to their household income. He'd started making comments about her not working around their 3rd anniversary, gentle at first but increasingly barbed, suggesting she was lucky to have married a man who could support her lifestyle, implying she spent her days shopping and lunching while he built their future. But Rebecca had swallowed her truth because some part of her had wanted to see if he'd love her without knowing about her empire. The test had failed spectacularly, but she'd continued it anyway, perhaps out of stubbornness, or perhaps out of fear that revealing her success would shatter whatever remained of their marriage, not realizing the marriage had already been crumbling for reasons that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the child they couldn't conceive. Vanessa Cole had joined Matthews' real estate holdings 18 months ago as a marketing coordinator, a striking woman in her late 20s with auburn hair and an aggressive ambition that reminded Rebecca of her younger self, though without the business acumen to back it up. Rebecca had noticed Daniel's attention shifting toward Vanessa during the company's summer retreat last year, had seen the way his eyes followed her across rooms, had watched him volunteer to work on projects with her team, but she'd convinced herself she was being paranoid, that her infertility struggles were making her see threats where none existed. By Christmas, Daniel had stopped initiating intimacy, claiming work stress and exhaustion, but Rebecca had smelled unfamiliar perfume on his shirts and had found hotel receipts in his jacket pockets. Receipts she'd confronted him about, only to have him explain them away, with lies she'd wanted desperately to believe. 3 months ago, Vanessa had announced her pregnancy to the office, with a glowing smile and a carefully worded statement about the father being committed and excited, and Daniel had come home that night with flowers and renewed interest in trying to conceive, his sudden attentiveness striking Rebecca as odd but welcome, not realizing he was covering his tracks, or perhaps assuaging his guilt. The truth had crashed down 2 weeks ago when Rebecca had returned home early from a property inspection in Seattle to find Daniel and Vanessa in their bedroom, not even having the decency to use a hotel, not even trying to hide what they'd been doing for over a year. Vanessa had been 7 months pregnant then, her belly prominent and proud, and she'd looked at Rebecca with something like pity mixed with triumph as she'd gathered her clothes. Daniel had tried to apologize, had started explaining that he hadn't meant for it to happen, that Vanessa understood him in ways Rebecca didn't, that he needed to be with a woman who could give him children. But Rebecca had held up her hand and told him to leave. Her voice, surprisingly steady considering her heart, was splintering into fragments too small to ever reassemble. He'd left that night, had moved in with Vanessa immediately, and had sent divorce papers to the house 3 days later with a note saying he hoped they could handle this civilly and that he'd be fair in the asset division, not knowing there were no shared assets to divide because everything he thought they owned together was actually hers alone. Rebecca had signed up for a routine physical the day after finding the divorce papers, needing to ensure her stress wasn't causing health problems, not expecting anything beyond maybe elevated blood pressure or vitamin deficiencies. The doctor had suggested a pregnancy test as part of the standard panel, and Rebecca had almost laughed at the cruel joke of it. But she'd agreed because protocol was protocol, and when the doctor had called her back with excitement in her voice, Rebecca had thought there must be some mistake. The ultrasound had confirmed it. 3 embryos, all healthy, all growing, all approximately 6 weeks along, which meant conception had happened during that brief period after Vanessa's pregnancy announcement, when Daniel had suddenly become attentive again. Rebecca had stared at the screen showing 3 flickering heartbeats, and had felt nothing but profound sadness because the babies she'd longed for were finally here, but their father had already chosen someone else, and revealing them now would only complicate everything in ways she didn't have the energy to face. She'd decided to tell him after the divorce was finalized, had planned to wait until the paperwork was signed and they were legally separated before dropping this atomic bomb. But Daniel had other plans. He'd called yesterday requesting an emergency meeting at her friend's office. He'd never realized the office she occasionally visited was hers, saying he needed to discuss something important. Rebecca had agreed, had arranged to meet him today at 3 o'clock, had dressed in her power suit and prepared herself for whatever new cruelty he might deliver. But she hadn't expected him to bring Vanessa, and she certainly hadn't expected what happened next. They'd arrived together at 2:58 p.m., Daniel in the charcoal suit she'd bought him last Christmas, and Vanessa in a maternity dress that emphasized her 8-month pregnancy, both of them wearing expressions that seemed coordinated, his apologetic but firm, hers victorious and smug. Rebecca's assistant, who knew exactly who signed her paychecks, had shown them into the conference room adjacent to Rebecca's private office, and Rebecca had taken her time walking from her desk to join them, every step a reminder that she controlled this space, even if Daniel didn't know it. She'd entered holding the divorce papers in one hand and her purse in the other, the ultrasound images burning like hot coals against her hip, but she'd kept her face neutral as she'd sat across from the man who'd vowed to love her in sickness and health. Daniel had started talking immediately, explaining that he wanted the divorce finalized quickly because Vanessa was due in 4 weeks, and he wanted to marry her before the baby came, wanted his child born to married parents, wanted to start his new family without the shadow of his failed first marriage hanging over everything. He'd outlined his proposed settlement. He'd take his 401k and his car. She could keep the house they'd bought 3 years ago and her grandfather's inheritance. They'd split their joint savings account evenly, and Rebecca had listened without interrupting, marveling at how someone could be so confident about dividing assets he knew nothing about. Vanessa had sat beside him with her hand on her belly, occasionally rubbing it in circles that seemed designed to torment Rebecca, and when Daniel had finally stopped talking, Vanessa had leaned forward with false sympathy dripping from her voice. "I know this must be so hard for you," Vanessa had said, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction that contradicted her concerned tone. "But Daniel deserves to be with a woman who can give him a family, and you have to understand that some women just aren't meant to be mothers. It's not your fault you're barren, but it's not fair to hold him back from his biological destiny either." The word barren had hung in the air like poison gas, but Rebecca had remained silent, her hand tightening around the ultrasound images in her purse as Vanessa had continued her monologue about how she and Daniel had tried to resist their connection, but love had won out. how their baby was a blessing that proved they were meant to be together, how Rebecca should be happy for them instead of making this difficult. Daniel had looked uncomfortable with Vanessa's speech, but hadn't contradicted her, and that silence had hurt more than any words could have, confirming that he'd shared Rebecca's intimate struggles with his mistress, turning her private pain into their public justification. Rebecca had been about to respond when Vanessa had stood up abruptly, had walked around the conference table with deliberate steps, and had stopped directly in front of Rebecca's chair. For a moment, Rebecca had thought Vanessa might offer a hug or some other inappropriately intimate gesture, but instead, Vanessa had tilted her head with calculated malice and spat directly onto Rebecca's face. The saliva had been warm and viscous, sliding down Rebecca's left cheek in a trail that represented every humiliation, every betrayal, every moment of the past year when Rebecca had been deceived. Vanessa had smiled then, had whispered just loud enough for Rebecca to hear, "Barren women deserve to be replaced." But Rebecca had simply reached into her pocket, had pulled out the silk handkerchief she always carried, and had wiped away the spit with movements so controlled they bordered on mechanical. Daniel had started to stand, had begun to say something that might have been an apology or might have been a defense of Vanessa's action, but Rebecca had held up the handkerchief, monogrammed with the letters MRH, Matthews Real Estate Holdings, and had stared at it for a long moment before looking directly at Daniel. "Do you know what these initials stand for?" she'd asked, her voice so quiet he'd had to lean forward to hear her, but he'd shaken his head, looking confused and slightly annoyed that she was changing the subject from the assault that had just occurred. Rebecca had folded the handkerchief carefully, had placed it on the table between them, and had pulled out her phone, opening her email and pulling up a message from her head attorney. "These are the initials of the company where you work," she'd said, watching his face for any flicker of recognition. "Matthews Real Estate Holdings, LLC, established 8 years ago with initial capital of $15 million from my grandfather's trust fund." Daniel's expression had shifted from confusion to disbelief as Rebecca had continued talking, her words precise and clinical, explaining that she'd founded the company 2 months after their wedding, that she'd built it from 1 property to 147 properties across 12 states, that the current valuation stood at $847 million according to last quarter's assessment. She'd pulled up documents on her phone, incorporation papers with her signature, property deeds with her name, tax returns showing her as sole owner and CEO, and had watched as Daniel's face had drained of color, his eyes darting between the screen and her face as if trying to reconcile the woman he'd thought was a housewife with the mogul sitting before him. Vanessa had started to say something dismissive, clearly thinking this was some elaborate lie, but Rebecca had pressed the intercom on the conference room phone and asked her assistant to bring in the portfolio books. When the assistant had arrived moments later, with 3 leather-bound volumes documenting every property, every acquisition, every financial statement from the past 8 years, Daniel had reached for them with shaking hands, flipping through pages that showed his signature on dozens of documents as the acquiring agent, documents he'd filed reports on, documents he'd celebrated as his own victories. Rebecca had watched him piece it together, how every major deal he'd closed had been approved by an anonymous LLC owner he'd never met, how every promotion he'd received had come through after consultations with upper management he'd never seen, how his entire career had been orchestrated by the wife he'd convinced himself contributed nothing to their life. She'd let the silence stretch as he'd absorbed the magnitude of what he hadn't known, and then she'd delivered the next revelation. "The house you think we bought together?" Rebecca had said, her tone conversational despite the devastation she was inflicting. "I bought it with cash through a subsidiary trust. Your name is on the title as a courtesy, but the deed is solely mine. The cars, the furniture, the art you think we've collected, all purchased with my money, all owned by my LLCs. She'd paused, letting that sink in before continuing. Your 401k that you want to take? That's yours, you're right about that. All $127,000 of it. Your car, also yours. I'll sign it over immediately. The joint savings account with $43,000. Take it all. I don't need it. Daniel had looked like he might vomit, his successful career suddenly recontextualized as a charity case, his male pride demolished by the realization that he'd been living in a reality completely different from the truth. Vanessa had tried to salvage the situation, had argued that none of this mattered because Daniel was still leaving, still choosing her and their baby. But Rebecca had turned to her with a smile so cold it had made Vanessa step backward. "About that baby," Rebecca had said softly, pulling a different folder from her purse. "I took the liberty of having some research done after Daniel moved in with you 3 weeks ago. It's amazing what you can find out about someone when you have resources." The folder had contained Vanessa's text messages, recovered through methods Rebecca's attorney had assured her were legal if unethical. Messages that showed Vanessa had been sleeping with 3 different men during the time of conception. Messages that discussed her plan to trap Daniel because he was the most financially stable option. Messages that revealed she'd deliberately stopped taking birth control while seeing multiple men because she'd wanted to get pregnant and then choose which father to claim based on who could provide the best lifestyle. Rebecca had slid the folder across to Daniel, who'd opened it with hands that couldn't seem to stop trembling, and she'd watched as he'd read exchanges between Vanessa and her best friend, discussing how the Matthews guy didn't need to know the baby might not be his until after the wedding, how she'd deleted her dating app accounts to cover her tracks, how she'd specifically targeted Daniel after learning he was desperate for a kid. Vanessa had lunged for the folder, but Rebecca had pulled out her phone again and tapped a few buttons. "I've already sent copies to my attorney and to yours, Daniel, though I suppose you don't have one yet since you thought this would be simple. The screenshots are time-stamped and verified, and while they don't prove definitively that the baby isn't yours, they certainly raise reasonable doubt, don't they?" She'd stood then, gathering her papers and her purse, preparing to leave her own conference room because she couldn't stand to be in it any longer. "I'll sign the divorce papers. In fact, I insist on it. I want this marriage dissolved as quickly as possible. But I won't be giving you any assets because we don't have shared assets, and I'd suggest you get a paternity test before you sign any birth certificates." She'd walked to the door, had opened it, and stood with her hand on the frame, and had looked back at Daniel one final time. "For what it's worth," she'd said, "I never wanted you for your money because I never needed your money. I wanted you because I loved you, because I thought we were partners, because I believed in the life we were building together. The fact that you left me for someone who could give you a child without ever considering that maybe the problem wasn't infertility but timing, without ever thinking that maybe medical intervention could have helped us if you'd been patient, that tells me everything I need to know about who you really are." She'd paused, had felt the weight of the secret in her purse, the ultrasound images she still hadn't revealed, but she'd decided he didn't deserve to know, not yet, not when he'd made his choice so decisively. "Goodbye, Daniel. I'll have my attorney send the finalized paperwork within 2 weeks. Enjoy your new life." She'd left them in the conference room, had heard Vanessa's voice rising in panic and Daniel's voice trying to calm her, but Rebecca had walked straight to her office and had closed the door behind her, leaning against it as the first tears finally fell. She'd cried for 20 minutes, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body, but then she'd wiped her eyes, had reapplied her makeup, and had pulled up the ultrasound images on her phone, staring at the 3 tiny forms that represented her future, a future that wouldn't include Daniel Matthews no matter what the DNA would eventually prove. The next 6 months had passed in a blur of legal proceedings, pregnancy symptoms she'd hidden from everyone except her doctor, and business decisions that had required more focus than Rebecca had thought possible given her emotional state. Daniel had demanded a meeting after discovering the text messages were real, had shown up at the house, her house, begging to talk, but Rebecca had refused to see him, communicating only through attorneys who'd filed the divorce papers with extreme prejudice. Vanessa had given birth to a baby boy 4 weeks after their confrontation, and Daniel had waited the recommended 2 weeks before demanding a paternity test, which had come back negative. The child was not his, but rather belonged to one of the other men Vanessa had been seeing, a bartender with no assets and no interest in fatherhood. Vanessa had tried to reconcile with Daniel, had claimed she'd made mistakes but still loved him, but Daniel had ended things definitively and had moved into a small apartment alone, his life imploding as Rebecca had watched from a distance. He'd tried to quit Matthews' real estate holdings, but Rebecca had offered him a substantial retention bonus through HR to stay, not out of kindness, but out of a desire to prove she was professional enough to separate business from personal matters. He'd accepted, perhaps because he needed the money or perhaps because he had nowhere else to go, with a resume that now felt tainted by the knowledge of how he'd gotten every success. Rebecca had given birth to triplets, 2 girls and a boy, on a Tuesday morning in late spring, 23 hours of labor that had resulted in 3 perfect humans who'd looked nothing like Daniel but everything like her. She'd named them without consulting him, had registered their births with her last name only, and had returned to work after 6 weeks with a nanny staff that cost more than most people's annual salaries but was worth every penny. She'd planned to tell Daniel eventually, had known she couldn't hide 3 children forever, but she'd wanted time to bond with them first, wanted to establish her routine as a single mother, wanted to prove to herself that she could do this alone before inviting complications. But fate had intervened in the form of a mandatory all-staff meeting at Matthews Real Estate Holdings, scheduled for a Tuesday morning exactly 6 months and 2 days after the triplets' birth. Rebecca had tried to reschedule it, but her executive team had insisted it was crucial for announcing a major acquisition, and so she'd made arrangements. Her assistant would bring the babies to the private executive suite adjacent to the boardroom where they'd stay with their nanny during the meeting, and Rebecca would duck out periodically to nurse them if needed. The meeting had started at 9 o'clock sharp, with Rebecca presiding over a table of 15 senior executives and managers, including Daniel, who'd avoided looking directly at her since she'd entered the room. She'd been presenting the acquisition details, a portfolio of commercial properties in Manhattan that would expand their East Coast presence, when one of the babies had started crying in the next room, a wail that had carried through the supposedly soundproof door. Rebecca had paused mid-sentence, had excused herself, and walked quickly to the suite. But the damage had been done. Everyone in the boardroom had heard the cry, and confusion had rippled through the executives who'd known Rebecca was single and had no children. She'd fed the baby, little Madison, who'd been hungry an hour earlier than expected, and had returned to the boardroom 10 minutes later, with Madison still in her arms because the girl had refused to settle with the nanny. The room had gone silent as Rebecca had re-entered, every eye fixed on the infant in her arms, but she'd simply adjusted Madison against her shoulder and had continued her presentation as if nothing unusual had occurred. She'd been 3 slides from the end when the doctor to the suite had opened again, and the nanny had appeared with the other 2 babies, both of them crying in tandem, clearly feeding off their sister's earlier distress. Rebecca had sighed, had set down her presentation remote, and had gestured for the nanny to bring them in. The sight of 3 infants, all clearly the same age, all bearing Rebecca's distinctive features, had caused an uproar of whispered conversations that Rebecca had silenced with a single look. She'd stood at the head of the table with Madison in her left arm and had accepted the other two babies from the nanny, somehow managing to hold all three at once in a juggling act that had looked precarious but felt natural after 6 months of practice. "For those of you who are confused," she'd said calmly, "these are my children, Madison, Sophia, and James, born 6 months ago. I apologize for the disruption, but as many of you know, breastfeeding schedules don't adhere to corporate meeting times." She'd scanned the room, had seen shock on most faces and calculation on a few, and then her eyes had landed on Daniel, who'd looked like he'd been struck by lightning, his face absolutely white, and his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. She'd watched him do the math. 6 months old, which meant conception had occurred approximately 3 months before that, which meant right around the time of their divorce, which meant these babies could possibly be his. But Rebecca had given him no confirmation, had simply asked her assistant to reschedule the remainder of the meeting, and had walked out of the boardroom with 3 babies in her arms, leaving chaos in her wake. Daniel had appeared at her office door an hour later, after she'd fed all 3 babies and handed them back to the nanny for their morning nap, his face still pale but his expression determined. He'd knocked tentatively, and Rebecca had debated not answering, but she'd known this confrontation was inevitable and had decided to face it on her own terms. She'd buzzed him in, had watched him enter her office, really seeing it for the first time, she suspected, noticing the diplomas on the walls, the awards on the shelves, the photographs of properties she'd developed, and had waited for him to speak. "Are they mine?" he'd asked, his voice breaking on the last word, his eyes pleading for an answer she wasn't sure she wanted to give. Rebecca had stood from her desk, had walked to the window overlooking the city she'd conquered, and had remained silent for a long moment, letting him suffer the uncertainty the way she'd suffered through 3 years of infertility treatments alone. When she'd finally turned back to him, her expression had been unreadable. "Why do you want to know?" she'd asked, genuinely curious about his motivation. "Why does it matter to you whether those babies share your DNA when you made it? Abundantly clear that you wanted nothing to do with me. When you left me for another woman and her child, when you threw away 8 years of marriage because you thought I was broken." She'd seen him flinch at her words, but she'd continued relentlessly. "Do you want to know because you suddenly care about fatherhood? Or do you want to know because you're terrified that you threw away children you'd longed for in pursuit of a fantasy that turned out to be a lie?" Daniel had started to answer several times, had opened his mouth and closed it again, clearly struggling to articulate something that made sense even to himself. Finally, he'd whispered, "I need to know if I'm a father. I need to know if I destroyed everything for nothing." The raw honesty in his voice had almost broken Rebecca's resolve, but she'd hardened her heart against sympathy, remembering Vanessa's spit on her face, remembering his eagerness to discard their marriage, remembering every moment of the past year when he'd made her feel worthless. "You destroyed everything regardless," she'd said flatly. "Whether those babies are yours or not doesn't change what you did, doesn't excuse your choices, doesn't make any of this hurt less." She'd pulled open her desk drawer, had retrieved a folder she'd prepared weeks ago in anticipation of this exact conversation, and had slid it across to him. "But since you asked, here's your answer. Those are the DNA test results. I had them done when the babies were born, using the toothbrush you left at the house as a comparison sample. My attorney assures me it would hold up in court if needed." Daniel had grabbed the folder with shaking hands, had opened it and pulled out the official laboratory report, and Rebecca had watched his face crumble as he'd read the conclusion. 99.99% probability of paternity for all three children. He'd sunk into the chair across from her desk without asking permission, his eyes scanning the document repeatedly as if hoping the words would change. And when he'd finally looked up at her, tears had been streaming down his face. "You were pregnant," he'd choked out. "You were pregnant when I left you, when I brought Vanessa to that meeting, when she spit on you and called you Barren. You knew you were carrying my children and you said nothing." Rebecca had felt no satisfaction in his anguish, only a weary acceptance that this moment had been inevitable from the second she'd seen those 3 heartbeats on the ultrasound screen. "I found out the day before that meeting," she'd confirmed, her voice steady despite the emotions roiling beneath her surface. "I'd planned to tell you after the divorce was final, thought maybe we could co-parent civilly once the legal messiness was behind us. But then you brought your pregnant mistress to my office, let her assault me, participated in humiliating me, and made it crystal clear that you saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to your happiness." She'd paused, had poured herself a glass of water from the carafe on her desk, and had taken a long drink before continuing. "So I decided you didn't deserve to know, not then, not when you'd made your choice so decisively." Daniel had wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, had stared at the DNA results as if they might offer some solution to this impossible situation, and had finally whispered, "What happens now? What do you want from me?" The question had been so typical of him, assuming that Rebecca wanted something from him, that she needed something from him, that his participation was required or desired in her life. She'd smiled then, a sad smile that had held no warmth but no malice either, just exhaustion and resignation. "Nothing," she'd said simply. "I want absolutely nothing from you, Daniel. I don't want child support. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I don't want your presence in their lives. They deserve better than a father who abandoned their mother because he thought she was defective. I don't want your name on their birth certificates. They're registered as Matthews, not with your surname, and that's how it will stay." She'd stood up, had walked to the door and opened it, clearly dismissing him. "You wanted to know if they were yours, and now you know. But being biologically related to someone doesn't make you their parent. Showing up, being present, loving unconditionally, those things make you a parent, and you've proven you're incapable of any of that." He'd stood as well, had clutched the DNA results to his chest, and had looked at her with desperation she'd never seen in him before. "Please," he'd begged, "please let me be part of their lives. Let me try to make this right. I'll do anything." But Rebecca had shaken her head firmly, had gestured toward the door with an impatience that brooked no argument. "You'll do what I tell you to do," she'd said coldly, "and what I'm telling you is to leave my office, continue doing your job here professionally, and accept that you made choices that have consequences you'll live with forever. Those babies deserve stability, love, and security, not a father who shows up out of guilt or obligation after rejecting their mother for being barren." She'd watched his face crumple again at the word barren, the same word Vanessa had used, the same word that had defined Rebecca's suffering for 3 years. "You made your decision when you chose Vanessa over me. Now live with it." But Rebecca hadn't been prepared for what Daniel would do next, hadn't anticipated the lengths to which desperation would drive him. 3 days after their confrontation in her office, she'd received an email from his attorney, a new one, not the lawyer he'd used for the divorce, informing her that Daniel was filing for joint custody of the triplets, claiming his parental rights had been violated by Rebecca's concealment of the pregnancy, arguing that he deserved equal time with his biological children regardless of their marital status. The email had outlined a proposed custody schedule, alternating weeks, holiday splits, joint decision-making on all major issues, and had threatened litigation if Rebecca didn't agree to mediation within 30 days. Rebecca had stared at her computer screen in disbelief, the audacity of his demands rendering her temporarily speechless. But then rage had flooded through her system, hot and energizing and absolutely clarifying. She'd immediately called her attorney, Diane Morrison, a shark of a family law specialist who'd guided Rebecca through the divorce, and had forwarded the email with a message that consisted of 2 words: destroy him. Diane had called back within an hour, had assured Rebecca that Daniel's case was weak at best, that courts generally favored mothers of infants, especially when the father had already demonstrated abandonment through divorce, and that they had plenty of ammunition to bury his petition under an avalanche of evidence about his character and choices. The custody battle had stretched over 4 months. 4 months during which Rebecca had been forced to relive every painful moment of her marriage's collapse, forced to submit to psychological evaluations and home studies, forced to document every feeding schedule and developmental milestone as if her competence as a mother were in question. Daniel's attorney had painted him as a reformed man who'd made mistakes but who deserved a chance to be a father, had argued that Rebecca's wealth shouldn't disqualify him from equal parenting time, had even suggested that Rebecca had concealed the pregnancy deliberately to punish him for leaving her. Rebecca's attorney had countered with the divorce timeline, with Vanessa's text messages proving Daniel's character flaws, with expert testimony about infant bonding and breastfeeding requirements, and with a devastating cross-examination of Daniel himself, during which he'd been forced to admit that he'd called Rebecca Barren, that he'd left her specifically because he thought she couldn't have children, that he'd made no attempt to contact her during her pregnancy or the first 6 months of the baby's lives because he hadn't known they existed. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd raised 4 children while building a legal career, had listened to 4 months of arguments and evidence before delivering her ruling on a Friday afternoon in late November, 11 months after the triplets' birth. Rebecca had sat in the courtroom with Diane beside her, wearing a navy suit that projected professional authority while managing to make her look softer than her usual corporate armor, and had watched Daniel sit across the aisle with his attorney, his expression hopeful in a way that had made Rebecca's stomach turn. The judge had reviewed the facts methodically, the timeline of the divorce, the pregnancy discovery, Daniel's relationship with Vanessa, the DNA test results, the months of sole maternal care Rebecca had provided, and Daniel's sudden interest in fatherhood only after learning the children existed. Mr. Matthews, the judge had said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of wisdom and experience, you've argued compellingly about your desire to be a father, about your regret over your choices, about your belief that you deserve a relationship with your biological children. But fatherhood isn't about biology or desire. It's about commitment, sacrifice, and unconditional love. She'd paused, had looked directly at Daniel with an expression that had mixed sympathy with disappointment. You divorced your wife because you believed she couldn't give you children. You moved in with a woman you thought was pregnant with your child. You made no effort to reconcile with your ex-wife until you discovered she'd given birth to triplets. Your actions demonstrate that your interest is in having children, not in being a father to these specific children. The judge had then turned to Rebecca, her expression softening slightly. Ms. Matthews has provided sole care for these infants since birth. She has established routines, bonded with them through breastfeeding and constant presence, created a stable home environment, and demonstrated every quality we look for in a primary custodial parent. While I acknowledge that Mr. Matthews has biological ties to these children, I find that his claim of violated parental rights is undermined by his own choices and by the fact that Ms. Matthews had no legal obligation to inform him of her pregnancy during their divorce proceedings. The judge had picked up her gavel, and Rebecca had held her breath, knowing the next words would determine the course of their lives. Therefore, I award sole legal and physical custody of Madison, Sophia, and James Matthews to their mother, Rebecca Matthews. Mr. Matthews will be granted supervised visitation of 4 hours per week at a location of Ms. Matthews's choosing, with the understanding that these visits may be increased to unsupervised visitation after 12 months if Mr. Matthews demonstrates consistent engagement and appropriate parenting skills. Daniel had made a sound like a wounded animal, but the judge had continued speaking, her tone firm. Furthermore, I am ordering Mr. Matthews to pay child support, calculated at the standard rate based on his income and the number of children, despite Ms. Matthews's substantial financial resources, because child support is the right of the child, not the custodial parent. Finally, I am granting Ms. Matthews' request for a restraining order preventing Mr. Matthews from appearing at her home or business outside of scheduled visitation times, given his pattern of attempting to force interactions that Ms. Matthews has explicitly declined. The gavel had fallen, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence, and Rebecca had felt something inside her chest finally release. Not happiness exactly, but relief, vindication, and a bone-deep certainty that she'd fought for her children the way no one had ever fought for her. Daniel had left the courtroom without looking at her, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and Rebecca had gathered her things slowly, letting Diane handle the immediate post-ruling logistics while she'd processed what had just happened. But the final blow had come 2 weeks later, during Daniel's very first supervised visitation at a family center that specialized in high-conflict custody situations. Rebecca had arrived with all 3 babies who'd been 11 months old by then and incredibly active, babbling and crawling and requiring constant attention. She'd dressed them identically in tiny jeans and sweaters that had cost more than Daniel's weekly salary, had packed their favorite toys and snacks, and had steeled herself for whatever might happen during this forced interaction between the babies and the father they didn't know. Daniel had been waiting in the visitation room with a supervisor present, and Rebecca had seen him try to hide his tears when she'd brought the babies in. But Madison had immediately started crying when Rebecca had tried to hand her to Daniel, clearly distressed by the stranger trying to hold her. Sophia had been slightly more tolerant, had allowed Daniel to hold her for about 3 minutes before reaching back toward Rebecca with increasing distress, and James had been the easiest of the 3, but had still shown clear preference for his mother. Rebecca had stayed in the observation room as required, had watched through the one-way mirror as Daniel had tried to engage with children who didn't recognize him, who had no bond with him, who saw him as an interloper in their carefully constructed world. Watching him struggle had given Rebecca no pleasure, but it had confirmed what she'd known all along, that Daniel had wanted the idea of children, not the reality of them, and that his interest would likely wane once he realized how much work parenting actually required. After 4 hours of crying, confusion, and ultimately Daniel sitting on the floor, looking defeated while the babies played with the supervisor instead of him, the visit had ended, and Rebecca had gathered her children with a relief she hadn't tried to hide. Daniel had asked when the next visit would be, and Rebecca had handed him the court-mandated schedule without comment, her face expressionless as she'd walked out of the center with her babies, not theirs, because biology might make you related, but it didn't make you family. Now, 6 months after that first visit and 18 months after the triplets' birth, Rebecca sat in her office on the 47th floor and reviewed Daniel's employment file, which her HR director had sent up for approval. He'd requested a transfer to the Los Angeles office, citing personal reasons and a need for a fresh start, and Rebecca knew exactly what those euphemisms meant. He couldn't handle working in the same building as the woman who'd beaten him at every turn, couldn't face the daily reminder of what he'd lost, couldn't maintain the facade of professional normalcy when everyone in the company knew the story of how he'd abandoned his secret billionaire wife for a mistress with another man's baby. Rebecca could have denied the transfer out of spite, could have forced him to continue working under her shadow, but she'd approved it with her signature and a note asking HR to process it immediately. She felt no victory in his departure, no satisfaction in his defeat, only a weary sadness for what might have been if Daniel had been a different man, if he'd loved her enough to weather infertility struggles together, if he'd chosen patience over betrayal. The triplets were thriving. Madison had started walking last week, Sophia was incredibly verbal for 18 months, and James had his mother's head for numbers, already sorting blocks by color and size with a focus that amazed their pediatrician. And Rebecca had built a life that felt full even without romantic partnership. She'd hired a nanny staff that felt like family, had developed friendships with other single mothers through a support group, had learned to find joy in midnight feedings and early morning giggles, had discovered that she was enough for her children even when she'd never felt like enough for Daniel. The divorce was final, the custody battle was settled, and Daniel would be moving 3,000 miles away, visiting the babies twice a month instead of weekly, because the distance made regular visits impossible, slowly fading from their lives like a photograph left in the sun. Rebecca knew he'd eventually stop coming altogether. The visits were too painful, the babies too indifferent, the reminder of his failures too constant, and she'd already prepared herself for the conversation she'd someday have with Madison, Sophia, and James about the father who'd chosen to leave twice, once before they were born and once after he'd learned they existed. She'd done what she'd set out to do, built an empire, had children, proved she was strong enough to survive anything. But the price had been higher than she'd ever imagined, costing her not just her marriage, but her faith in love itself. As she looked out at the Manhattan skyline, at the buildings she owned and the city she'd conquered, Rebecca Matthews felt the weight of her victory and understood that some wars are won, but leave the victor changed in ways that can never be undone, carrying scars that no amount of money or success could ever heal, living with the knowledge that she'd been strong enough to crush the man who'd betrayed her, but wondering if that strength had cost her the softness she'd need to ever trust someone again.